Hi, this is Michael Venema, and thanks so much for joining in 16-Minute Church this week. A few lines from one of the Psalms in the Bible. I will sing praises to God among the nations, for your steadfast love is above the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth.
What gift of grace is Jesus, my Redeemer? There is no more for heaven now to give. He is my joy, my righteousness and freedom, my steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace.
This week we're looking at what I think is a super interesting passage in Mark, the Good News according to Mark. And it's interesting for two reasons. One of them is that it's a change of pace from what's gone on immediately before. All through chapter 4, Jesus has been teaching. Now at the end of chapter 4, which is where we are, we find ourselves on the water in a boat and a storm descends on the boat. And at the end of this passage about the storm, Jesus heads back into the fray, back into doing battle with the dark spirit world and even doing battle with death. But that's material for next week. So between this section where Jesus is busy teaching and a section where Jesus is busy doing battle, we find this story about Jesus being on the water in a boat with his disciples. And here is how the passage reads. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And there were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up. Jesus was in the stern. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now where it says, "that day when evening came," you can look up what day Mark had in mind just by reading the text just before our reading. That would be the day during which Jesus had been teaching his disciples and the larger audience, the crowd that Mark mentions. Now, often when people think of this story, and that might be you in case you've heard it before, we think of Jesus and his disciples going out into the Lake of Galilee, a boat by itself. But that isn't exactly what we read here. There were a number of boats. And this makes total sense because there's a crowd. Jesus was popular. Crowds we were right there present in order to hear Jesus teach and for many of them to be healed. And so when Jesus embarks in a fishing boat, naturally other boats tag along. This is a cool detail to notice because it means that whatever happens next, it likely isn't just the disciples in the boat with Jesus who will see it. It's also the occupants in the other boats who will witness what is about to happen. Now what happens is this, as we just read. A storm comes down upon the boats. The storm is fierce enough so that the boat that Jesus is in danger of sinking. Jesus, probably dog-tired from his activities of teaching, is sound asleep. And the disciples have to rouse him, which they do. And it's like they seem to think that Jesus should be helping them row or bail water or whatever it would take to keep the boat afloat until they could get to shore. And presumably some or all the other boats are also in trouble. The crews and the taggers along, all in danger of drowning. So what happens next, I don't have to repeat. Jesus calms the storm, and that's pretty remarkable. But did you notice that he rebukes the disciples for being afraid? Now, they had seen Jesus perform many miracles, so why could they have not been a bit more confident that Jesus would get them through the storm and to the opposite shore on the lake? They'd seen him do a lot of amazing things. Couldn't they have remembered that Jesus will probably do just fine and take care of them? So hitting the panic button wasn't necessarily the right thing for them to do. But what I really want to notice is the response of the disciples. Mark says that the disciples were terrified. Now, it's not unusual to discover that terror is one of the responses that we find in the Old Testament, the pre-Jesus parts of the Bible. That's one of the responses when God shows up. God is powerful. He shows up. People are terrified. It's like, as C.S. Lewis points out, God is not necessarily safe. But we also have to notice that typically when people respond that way to the presence of God, God will say something like, "Be at peace. Do not be afraid." So the disciples responded not just with this emotion of fear, but also with a question. Terrified and understandably awestruck, they ask, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Now this is where Mark ends the story, and it's a very clever ending. Clever because it leaves the reader to respond to the question, just exactly who is this? The disciples were Jewish, so of course was Jesus, along with nearly all the people in his audiences. And therefore, they knew that their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Jewish people all through many centuries of struggle, their God is the creator of heaven and earth. He is the creator of wind and waves. In one of the Old Testament stories, God commands the sun to shine longer. In another, he commands drought and rain. In one story, he commands the winds to blow and the waters to part, allowing his people safe passage across the bottom of the Red Sea. Psalm 104 says this, "God, you covered the earth with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, but at your rebuke, the waters fled." And how about this from Psalm 107? God stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. Those out on the sea were glad when the storm grew calm and God guided them to their desired haven. Whoa! Doesn't that connect with exactly what Jesus is doing, calming the storm, saving his disciples, and the occupants of the other boats? So tell me, who exactly is this Jesus? Who is he?
To this I hold, my help is only Jesus, for my life is wholly bound to his.
We're following Matthew's record of Jesus teaching his disciples on a mountainside, and the reason we've been following Matthew for a number of videos now is to connect with the teachings of Jesus for how we need to think and how we have to conduct our lives. So I'm looking at two short passages in the Sermon on the Mount, two passages back to back that I want to sort out this week. Matthew 6:22 to 24. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Even the light that is in you is darkness. Then how great is that darkness? Now this short passage comes right after Jesus has said to his listeners that they should not spend their lives piling up material possessions and exciting experiences. Instead, he said, build up a pile of treasure in heaven. In other words, do the good things that Jesus has been teaching the people all through the Sermon on the Mount. Such things will not be forgotten. God will preserve them. Those righteous deeds will remain as things to be celebrated. They are part of the story of your and my obedience to Jesus, and part of the story of God's blessing both in this life and in the life to come. They will not be lost, those things, those treasures. But then we come to this passage about the eye being either good and bringing light into the soul, or dark, bringing darkness into our souls. How does that fit with those lines just before? I'm not totally sure. And maybe it's not something to worry about too much. For the most part, passages in Matthew and in the other Gospels too do have a flow. They're not disjointed, disconnected from each other. But while the connections between many, many passages are not at all difficult to see, this one seems to be connected only by virtue of the fact that it, like the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, teaches us to manage our attitudes, our interior life, and our thoughts, as well as our behaviors, to manage them in accordance with God's requirements. How then should we read this passage, which on the surface seems kind of cryptic, kind of mysterious? And I would say that the passage assumes that there's a connection between how we see, between the eye, how we see the world, and the kinds of things that enter the eye, the kinds of things that find a home in our minds, in our hearts, in our souls. If we spend all our life focusing on dark, violent, disturbing things, then no doubt our consciousness will be filled with concerns and impressions that are dark and violent and disturbing. This is the problem with being a fan of gangsta rap or of gang culture. This is the problem as seeing the world as a theater of class struggle, as the modern disciples of Karl Marx see it. After a while, all you can see is conflict between groups, violent protests, and threats to justice. And I do not believe that that is how God intends for you to see the world. On the other hand, if you see the good in people and in the world, the chances are that your soul, your mind, your heart will become filled also with good. Out of that kind of mindset, your own words and actions will bring healing and grace to others. Now then, lastly, these last few lines. No one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and you'll love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and money. Now these lines bring us back to the passage just a few lines earlier where Jesus has taught, don't build up material possessions and these kinds of things, but build up treasures in heaven. You can try serving two masters. It's way too stressful. You can try having two jobs, but chances are you'll begin to favor one over the other. Now, I've had that experience. Once I was working with university students, Christian student groups. It was an exciting time, and I believe that God called me to do it. But along the way, I became the pastor of a church, and it was a struggle to maintain a heartfelt interest in both. Eventually, I had to choose one or the other. And this, Jesus says, is how it is if you try to serve God on the one hand, and on the other hand, to give your life to acquiring money and possessions and exciting experiences. Eventually, you'll have to choose. And of course, as Jesus has already made clear a few verses earlier, one of the choices will lead to disappointment as your possessions begin to own you, and you will one day all have to let them slide into decay and nothingness because you will die. But the other choice leads to everlasting fulfillment with God.
Oh, how strange and divine. I can sing on his mind, yet not I Savior